Okay, so earlier I made, just on the desktop, a folder called Maya Demo where I've made this render scene. So this is not in my project, which is in this particular folder because I've set up a project correctly here. So I'll just open this scene and then resave it into the correct folder. So I've got my scene here. I'm just going to go File, Save Scene As. We can see straight away this is bringing me back to that desktop folder. If I just click Scenes, you can see now we're in the current project. So it's a nice easy way to jump to where I need to be. If you ever have files that you've saved elsewhere because you're just doing a quick bit of modeling and then you thought, actually, let's turn this into a project, it's very easy to bring them in like this. So render scene 01, let's save this. Okay, so let's import all of the objects that we've created. So import and position them. And just set up a basic scene and do a little bit of lighting and rendering, add some materials, and see what we end up with. So one by one, I'm inputting these. Okay, I think I've realized what I'm doing here. The file names are overriding. So I haven't gone and named. This is actually a reasonable example of why you should be naming things. So let's just go new scene. Before I do that, I won't close it all. I'll get rid of that cube. And just center pivot, reset that real quick. Everything needs to be named uniquely, so let's call this a warpy thingy, whatever. This is big pipe. Tube 1 and tube 2. And let's save it. File, save, scene as. This is my render scene. I think I have a render scene 02 somewhere. If you're ever unsure, it's not here, but I'm just going to call this 03. I'm just nervous about calling that 02 if I'm overriding something. So save that as 03. So now that that's saved, let's just make a new scene and import these squiggly lines that didn't want to come in before. And so that's come in just fine. And as you can see, it's called pcube2. Before I had another file in there called pcube2. So it's an important one. Let's just rename these Ziggy, whatever. And now I can import our squiggly, and this is Ziggy. So I've got Ziggy 01, 02, and what I'll do is actually export both. I don't even need to select them. I can go File, Export, All. Instead of export the specific thing I've selected, I'm exporting all as an FBX. And I'll call this all, lowercase, all, whatever, all zigzags. Jump back to my render scene 03, don't save it. Import all zigzags, no worries. Let's turn that stage back on in the channel box in the layer editor and start setting things up. So let's see, these are a bit big. Let's just scale them down and we'll rotate them J to snap. So they're rotated 90 degrees. And I'll do the same with these. Just going to rotate them both, holding down. I don't even need to hold down anything. I can just rotate 90 in the Y. I'm missing something. Oh, the cube. Okay, so let's jump in and set up some lights and materials. Create the scene. Before I start, I might just set up a camera and figure out what sort of resolution I want to work with. So create cameras and go with the camera. So we can see the camera here. I find the easiest way by far to figure out how to set up your scene is to look through the camera. You have to look through it really. So with the object selected that you want to look through in the viewport menu, panels, look through selected. And so now I'm looking through the camera. So be aware that you're looking through the camera. And if you, so, you know, I'm just using my orbit and pan and zoom and everything to position it how I want. But it's important to be aware of where it is, because if I accidentally move while I've got this camera selected, I'll be changing the camera view. I just like to quickly set it up and then jump out of that view by going back to perspective. And you can see there's the camera looking down there. I'll jump back into it, look through camera, look through selected. Now, all we're seeing here is the actual viewport, not the correct actual resolution of our scene. So what you really want to do is turn on the resolution gate. So this will show us the final resolution. At this stage, I'm not doing any modeling. I might get rid of my poly count. So display, head up display, poly count. Just get rid of that. And I want to figure out what resolution I want. I don't want such a big wide screen. So I'll come into my render settings. So these clipboards with the gear icon is the render setting. Here it is. And we'll say using Redshift. If you don't have that option for Redshift, of course you have to have downloaded and installed Redshift. Even if you're just using the free version, which is watermarked, it's still fully featured. It's a great renderer. So if you don't have that option, you need to activate it in your plugin manager. So Windows, Settings, Preferences, Plugins, and go down to where you see Redshift for Maya and make sure it's loaded. At the same time, any other renderers should be disabled. So in this case, I've got Arnold here, which ships with Maya in 2018 and 2019 standard. Disable that just to reduce any chances of conflicts. Okay, so I'm looking through, I'm looking at my render settings here, and in the common tab, the very first tab, I'm going to scroll down and we can see what resolution we're looking at. Now I can use a preset, and there's heaps of options here, or I can just customize it, which is what I'm going to do. For the purposes of having a quick render, I'm going to keep it fairly low res. I might go 400 by 400 pixels. But I also wanted a square image, just because. So in my viewport now, I might zoom in a little. And of course I haven't actually set up the scene yet. I'm just trying to get the position of the camera. So I'll go with something like this. And now, what I'd like to do, I'll turn off the outliner here. I like to go to this button to get two screens. So one I like as my perspective, and the other one over here will change to the camera. I could click it and say look through camera. I do have the option to make a new camera, but that's not what I want to do. I can come into here as well, just go to the panels window, perspective, and that lets you change into perspective views or into any of these side views. So it's yet another way. Instead of doing, say, front view, I could go, you know, if I'm in some other view, I could go panels, orthographic, front view, does the same thing. What I want here is a perspective viewport, and I want the camera. So this just lets me see what my final image will be. Okay, so what I want to do is start setting up my scene. I'm just thinking I might actually create a little bit of a backdrop. So I'm just going to put a cube in. Make it quite wide. Bringing it to the foreground. So I've decided I want just like a little sort of bench to have objects sitting on. I'll put some objects on top of this and some in the background. Now, because I'm going to see this very edge, let's just bevel this a little bit. With this one, I'm just beveling the whole model. I'm going to keep it just to two edges. Let's see. I think I will smooth it, so I will go a couple of segments. Keep it pretty small and bevel, so it gives us just a nice little beveled edge there. So hit Q to get out of that, and we'll just put a smooth onto it. Okay. I might make that a little wider. Move it back. So I want to see a little bit of the front. And these objects I can put on top. Maybe make it a bit smaller. So, you know, I don't know exactly what I'm doing. I'm not trying to create a very specific scene here. It's just a bunch of objects that I'd like to render and set up in some sort of quirky way. So, even though we made a scene, what I'm thinking I'd like to do is, I'm going to need to experiment. So I'll try working with the scene, but I was considering just making another couple of these. Essentially, I'm wondering, so I've just, Control Z, duplicate. I was wondering what would happen, how would it look if I had an object as my backdrop. And I kind of like this idea. I might just duplicate a couple of these. You know, this is experimental. This is kind of the fun of 3D. Normally with this sort of stuff, it's more modeling when you're sitting there, especially if you're new to it. You're sitting there modeling bizarre little spaceships and whatever. And you just kind of experiment to work out what works and what doesn't, and what sort of shapes you want to create. And these sort of more, I guess, expressionist, artistic type scenes, you can also experiment with doing crazy stuff. Yeah, I'm going to go with this. So for now, I'm not using this stage, so I'll just hide that layer where I've put the stage, because I like this divide. And what I'd like to do is replicate this divide in some way down here through color. So I'll keep this bench the same, but what I want to do is set up two different colors on these and two different colors on these. So before I proceed, I'll demonstrate what I mean by adding some colors to our scene. So let's open up the hypershade. It's the sphere here with a little sort of specular highlight that's meant to be like a sphere with a shiny part on it. I always think of it kind of like a billiard ball, whatever. This little icon opens up our hypershade. I've got a whole bunch of Lamberts, just because I've inputted all those models. So I've just deleted those, and you can see when they go green, it means it has no shader. So it doesn't know what shader I want to use. I could open the outliner and just select just my materials and apply to selected objects, my default Lambert one. So if I cared about that, but I'm going to go through. I'm going to go through creating some Redshift shaders. So I'm just minimizing Maya and just looking at Redshift. And for now, I'm just moving the cursor over here. So this is, even though it's looking through the camera, obviously I can still select things in here. For now, I'm just going to set up a color. I want 1, 2, and those same 2 colors I'm going to use twice down here. So that's 2 colors and then 3 colors. For now, I'm just making 3 colors because I know I want 3 shaders. I'm going to make 3 of them using the Redshift material. So that's our standard shader for Redshift. I'm going to click it 3 times. Don't worry about down here. So this is our working area, and you can clear that if you want to by clicking that button. Really all that matters is this window is the shaders in our scene, and this window is the properties for the currently selected shader. So let's call, I'm trying to think of a color palette. At this point, you would really want to start using a bit of design theory and maybe opening up a color wheel and thinking about complementary colors or opposing colors and whatnot. But I'm just going to wing it because at the end of the day, this is just a demonstration of how to use Maya for beginners. So let's just call one, I'll call it pink, and I'll click in the color and pick a pink color. And in here, I might move it back a bit so it's just a little more faded. Come down to the roughness. Let's see, maybe in reflection actually. So I'll leave the roughness in the diffuse color just as is, but in the reflection setting, I'm going to change the roughness. As you bring it down, you can see the specular highlight. You notice that this image, that looks kind of similar to that. That's what I think they're trying to replicate there with this, icon for shader. So we're looking at a shiny shader with like a shiny little highlight. The more I go this way, the more sort of dispersed that specular highlight becomes. And so at 0, it's full and covering, like the whole object is fully lit with the center of the light. It's the way the shader's designed. So I want a little bit of roughness in there. And I might just go with that for now. The next one, let's call this blue. I'll pick a blue color. Maybe go a little bit more, a little bit less sort of electric blue. Something like that. Touch more of that shade, yep. And again, I'll muck around with the roughness. I might make this one quite high roughness level. And for this one, instead of building my own, I will change the color, but I'm going to start with the presets. These are really handy. They're great starting points. Let's go with plastic. And if we look at that, we're not seeing a great difference, but if we scroll down, it's got some settings set up. You can basically dig through the settings and figure out what it's doing. I'm going to pick, so looking at this color wheel, I've got one from this side, one from this side. So let's go for one right here. So you basically, essentially have picked roughly thirds of this color wheel. And name it, of course. So this is I'll just call it green. And to apply them to my materials, holding down the scroll wheel, so the middle mouse button, my cursor changes to that little plus symbol. So middle mouse button, holding it and dragging it onto the object I want. And the blue. Now for the front here, I'm just going to just close this hypershade window for a moment. For the front here, I want to have a division somewhere through here and have the opposite colors on this object. So the way I'll do that is in my viewport here, I'm going to change, just accidentally moved that, I'll Control Z. That's a good reason why you always hit Q, get out of your tools, so you don't accidentally move or scale or something. Top view. And what I want to do is create a cut somewhere through here, which is nice and easy with the multi-cut tool. So I want it to end pretty much right where this line is. Actually, change my mind, I kind of want it to end slightly in front. So let's go about here to there. So starting outside the model and finishing outside the model. Come back to perspective. So it creates that cut all the way through. And what I want to do now is select all of the faces on one side, which will probably be easier to do if I can roughly line it up so that this is straight. I can drag, select, and then hold down Control to unselect. I'll just isolate this. Sorry, I'm going back to object mode. Let's isolate this model. So this button, so we're just seeing this. Back to the faces and hit F. So it's just easy to pan around and see I've got exactly those. And the reason I've done this is I want to split these into two separate models, but exactly the same shape, holding the exact same position in space. So with these faces selected, what I can do is go into Edit Mesh, come down in the face section to Extract, and I click on that, and what it does is turn that into a separate object. But you can see they're perfectly aligned because it started out as a single object. I'll turn off my isolation so I can see them all. Open up the hypershade. Of course, I could have just minimized that and brought it back, but whatever. And now for this, I'll make this one the blue. I'll make this one the pink. And that gives us a nice starting point for setting up our scene. Let's just add one more object in there just so it's not quite so empty. And for now, I'll just leave it grey. Jumping to the side view, just positioning it so it's touching the base. And I'm going to incremental save. I can use this, so I'll just demonstrate if I click on that. What that actually does, based on the way I've got it set up, is it adds a dot point and 3 zeros and a 1, which I don't really like. I prefer 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3. So what I can do, I'll just go File, just to rename it, File, Save Scene As. I want to come back to this convention, naming convention. Alright, so let's set up some lights. So I'll come into Redshift and use the lights here. These are the same as your lights in the Create menu. So Create Lights. You just need to make sure you select the Redshift lights. Redshift doesn't support the standard Maya lights. So Redshift Physical Light, either through this Create menu or through here, the same thing. So this creates, by default, an area light. And if I come into the Attribute Editor, that lets me change my settings. So I'm going to use a spotlight. And so it's kind of like a real-world studio spotlight to light up a scene. And what I want to do in here is look through selected. So I'm looking through the light. You can see the physical light that I'm looking through. And just generally position it so I've got a general idea of its position, where it's pointing in the center of the scene. And that's about all I need to do for now. So I'll come back to perspective mode. So we want to set it up so it's roughly there. Maybe back a little bit this way, so it's not too close to it. Something like that. Now I'm going to use Redshift's IPR renderer. I have seen this renderer. This is the interactive renderer. It's really nice and very helpful for easily setting up your lights. You need to render to see what your lights are doing in Redshift. Usually this is quite nice. I have seen it crash a little bit on some computers. So what I always like to do is save before anything major, save before doing a render. And I'm going to click the IPR. And so it's currently rendered through the perspective camera, which is active. One way to just make it render the one you want is middle click in the viewport here. So I've just middle clicked in my camera. If I were to click the IPR now, it's going to render since this view is active. Whereas if I click this one, it's rendering from whatever's active. But really what you do is come in through here, IPR renderer, and then pick where you want to render from. So camera 1. Now at any time I make a change, So if I were to move this light up a little bit, we can see it instantly updates. So what I want to do is start adjusting this light. Now this is set to spotlight. So by default it comes in as an area. We've changed it to a spot, which means I don't need the area settings. I'll close that and open the spot settings. And it's this fall off. So as we change this, you can see what it's doing is increasing that fall off quite significantly. I want to set it up so that we're getting a tiny bit of fall off towards the top, but we're also getting a bit of an angle for that fall off to occur. So you can see that's quite sharp, and the fall off softens as we increase that value. Now the intensity I'm going to bring down. Let's just use the slider. I'm not going to worry about this too much because it's just my first light. We're going to make a few changes. I don't like how it's perfectly arced like this. So in this viewport with that light selected, I'll look through it. Let's just try angling it. Yeah, that's kind of more what I wanted. Just a little bit of shading through there, and then I'll increase this fall off value under the spot setting. Let's bring it down. And now what I'll do is come into the shadow settings and just increase the transparency. I'll soften the edge. So I'm really just mucking around. It's the way you render is trying settings until it starts to behave the way you want. So I'm just trying to soften the edge of the shadow that it's causing. And I might just give it a very slight, let's go with a cooler color. Just trying to be subtle. You want to be careful with colored lights, but just getting a little bit of a cooler color. And now before I muck around too much more with that, let's jump back to perspective and make another light for the other side. I'll select this one, Control D to duplicate, drag it over here. Now if this light here is acting as our primary key light, this one should be a slightly different angle, slightly lower intensity, so maybe about 80. Let's adjust it, of course, so we're looking at our scene. So look through selected, and we'll get in a bit closer and a bit lower. So this is creating a whole lot of secondary light. I'm just mucking around. With this one, I want the cone angle to be much greater. So of course I'm getting that really high highlight out there. Yeah, I kind of like these shadows to be quite subtle. Just a little sense of the shadowing from it. And again, I'm just basically experimenting, trying different things to see what sort of result I get. Let's zoom out a little. So I'm just thinking about this specular highlight. I like it in there, but I also don't want it too overbearing, so just a hint of it would be nice. And lower. And let's change this to more of a warm color to just get a bit of variation in our scene. Okay, and before I muck around too much more with that, let's add something to just fill out some of this darkness, so a fill light. So I'm going to add a new light, physical light, and we'll leave this one as an area light. I'll rotate this facing downwards. And I just notice you can see the light shape. So if I come into the area light settings for this area light that we've made, click visible, and that will disappear from the light. Okay, so I want this quite large and quite soft. It's going to be very soft by the look of it. And of course, it doesn't need to be right where it's sitting, so let's drag this up. It should be this kind of angle, maybe not a bit too much. So it really fills out the scene. Let's go a bit quieter. Yeah, it's touch more, 1.5. So you can see the area light's a lot stronger than other lights. I'll leave the shadows on because I like the little gap it's creating in there. It looks nice. And just the whole framing of it, I kind of want just push it over. Just want to get this side a little bit over on the extreme right of frame. Okay. So we're starting to get a scene. It's starting to look like something. I don't know what, but it's a scene. Let's just whoops. Actually, yeah, I only need the one view now. Okay, I might just apply a shader to this object, and let's make a new Redshift material. And for this one, I'm just going to use one of the presets, and I'll get something. Let's take a look at platinum. So these metals are very shiny. That's kind of cool. What I'll do is close the IPR and file save scene. Just make an incremental save. Save as 05. Okay, so let's bring in these other objects we created. I've got everything quite large. I will come back to the camera view. So 2 views. Again, panels, perspective camera, just so I can see the framing. But at this stage, I'm not playing around with the lights. I don't want to worry too much about the rendering. So I've turned off the IPR. It's starting to lag. We'll probably have to switch to bucket rendering pretty quickly. Let's see, what I might do, I don't know, let's make this one real small and actually bring it down here somewhere. Yeah, whatever. And duplicate this. What I might do here, actually, I'll undo. I'll duplicate a couple of these objects. I'll come into the channel box. Now, what I want to do here is get rid of all these values, but leave it in the same spot. So I freeze out these transformation values. So I'm coming into, with the model selected, into Modify, Freeze Transformations. What that does is zero everything out. So now if I duplicate and scroll down, I can go, well, let's just type in -1. Maybe 0.5 that way. And I'm going to duplicate another one. And for this, I'll type in -2 and 1. So it's just incrementing the amount, the value. I had a triangle piece that doesn't seem to have loaded. Let's Control S to save. Import. I thought there was another piece. Where'd that go? Triangle. Turn on the wireframe. Can't see it. Did it come in? There it is. I've got that and this piece in here. They're just hidden behind the objects. So sometimes the wireframe's useful to help you figure out where you've misplaced things. Of course, working with here in the outliner, it's really useful if your objects are named. So, p cube, who knows what that could be. And if you've got 30 p cubes, it's going to be very confusing. All right, so this thing I'll bring in, place it on the ground. Let's jump to the front view, side view rather. So I've modeled this in the side, which is not great, but it works. Let's rotate it a little. Don't want it at the same angle as that cube, so I'll just sort of rotate it. Probably like that, I guess. Let's see, that's not bad. Doesn't really matter. I kind of like the idea of getting a flow that flows up in this direction. This thing, let's bring it in. I'm going to hold down J, rotation, just to snap that around that way. Go to the front view, let's take a look, side view, let's take a look. Make sure it's roughly touching the ground. Yeah, that'll work, I guess. And that just leaves these things, which are quite large, so I'll shrink them down, bring them in. Alright, so I'll start with this one. What I might do is just hold down D and the middle mouse and move the pivot to here, back to perspective. So the pivot's roughly where I want this object connected, so now it's going to rotate around that spot, which is nice. And let's have this object slightly in front of where it ends. And then this one, it's getting a bit messy, but art can be messy. Weird squiggly line just floating in space, I guess, could work. Good enough. Let's throw some materials on there. I might make a, let's see, from our custom ones. Let's look at this jade material. I think I'll pick a real strong purple. No. That's better. Okay, that works. Let's make a glass. So I just dragged on that glass and missed it. If I just select the object I want, this is material 6, which I should be naming. I've stopped renaming them because it's glass. With this selected, hold down right mouse, apply to selection. Okay, I did select it, but it needs to render to see what we're doing. So Control S to save before we lose any work. And let's do a render. So this camera view is currently active. Instead of IPR, I'm just going to click render the current frame, which will render whatever viewport is currently active, and it will bucket render. So it's a bit slower, but it'll go all the way through and render it out correctly. It looks weird, but I'm going to go with it. Let's do this guy as well. And these ones, I'm tempted to do... I might do the opposite for the middle one. But what I'd like to do is try maybe a yellow, go plastic. Let's just see, so shift select both of those, and I'll do this one as well. Apply to selection, and make sure this is the active viewport. Click render. It's a thing. It's kind of cool, but it's kind of weird. I like the idea. I like how this is. I'm going to duplicate this. Now that it's got a material applied, oops, rotate. I can just duplicate it and it's going to replicate a few times. I just like the idea of making a bit of kind of spaghetti mess. So I'm going to duplicate it again. Let's just rotate from a different angle. Maybe scale it a bit. My scale I would like to reset, so I'm coming into, I'll just get rid of the hypershade, come into the tool settings and just go reset, so I go to world space. So I can scale it a bit. And let's duplicate this one. Scale it that way. Let's rotate it somewhat. So it's definitely looking messy, but because it's transparent, kind of gets away with it. And I might also rotate a bit more in Z space. And middle click here to activate it, do a render. Let's see if that's just horrible or kind of vaguely works. Yeah, kind of vaguely works. Alright, so let's just clean up our scene. We've got a lot of noise in here. What I'd like to do now is work on some global illumination. So let's incremental save. And so what we can do is open up our render settings, and in Redshift, come into the GI, Global Illumination, and we can set up these secondary light bounces. So I'll set the first one to just brute force, and the secondary bounce will make a point cloud, iridescence point cloud, and leave that at all the other settings as they are. Now we definitely want to use, oops, I've just moved that, so again, try to get in the habit of hitting Q or clicking your select tool. We definitely can't use IPR anymore. We need to bucket render because it's going to start increasing in our render times. And because I've added a whole lot of new light, it's a little bit unpredictable how this will go, but That's not too shabby. What I should have done is looked at before and after. So at the moment I'm doing a single render. I'll just close that, and what I'll do is temporarily, just to show you the difference, and I want to show you a specific tool, so I'll render before I turn that on. And these icons save the image. So when I click that, you can see I've got a time slider. So now if I turn these back on, brute force primary, secondary iridescence, and I'm going to increase the number of rays it's casting. Let's try 64, hit render. So now our render times start to slow down, and this is where you're very happy to be using a GPU renderer. So much quicker than the old CPU rendering like Arnold. Cool, let's save this one. So now, because I've added these saves, what you can do is jump between them and see the difference. So that was before I turned on global illumination, and then afterwards it's just slightly increasing the light. We're getting true secondary light bounces. So what I'll do is for now just leave these settings, come back to the lights. I'll go back to just full screen, I'm just rendering there. I'll come into this light, into the attribute editor, and the shadow samples, I'll increase these 64, I'll do that on both actually. And likewise with this area light. Now we've got no transparency, so let's just, I'll open up this button opens up your last render, and I can just go render from the camera one, so re-render. So now I can click, now that this is open, I can click this button anytime to re-render. So again, it's starting to slow down with an increased value setting. But it's looking kind of cool. We're getting some nice materials. It's generally not bad. It's just the number of samples in our scene. So what I've been doing there by going into individual lights and adjusting the samples of those lights. Let's change this area light to, I think this one's actually pretty significant. I'm going to really crank this up and just see how we go. Hit render. So while that's rendering, I can explain. What I'm doing is jumping into local elements. I'm jumping into a light, changing its settings, jumping into another light, changing its settings. So I'm on a local level, changing individual parts of the scene. I'm not just going into my main render settings and jumping in and playing around with the samples. So you've got all sorts of options here to muck around with your minimum, maximum samples. This is kind of not a great way to go. It's the reason Redshift is so powerful is that everything is customizable. So I could go into the materials and adjust how their number of samples each material is receiving, stuff like that. But you can see now by increasing that area light, this has given me quite a nice render. I don't really want to muck around too much with these settings. So it's kind of more or less the effect I was after. It's a bizarre setup, and at this stage you really want to, like I totally just improvised this. I didn't base it off anything. I did come across an image just earlier of the background that's very similar to this, which is why I went with this way. So apologies for whoever I stole that off. I can't remember. I just saw it randomly online, but just having the two different colors in a vertical wall and a front wall. And then I just obviously just made these random shapes and threw them into a scene. Really what you'd probably want to be doing as the next step is unwrapping a couple of these objects and putting on textures. So at the moment they're not unwrapped, they've just got a simple material that's a solid material over the whole object, which is a great way to get started. And you can see it does make some pretty images, but it's you can go a lot further when you actually start texturing objects. So that's something I'll get into down the track, but for now, this was, fairly entry level, no prior knowledge assumed. We've gone from, presumably this is the first time potentially that you've ever opened Maya, to being able to at least create an image from scratch that, you know, looks reasonable. Like it's a bizarre thing. You haven't gone and made your favorite character or weapon from a game or whatever, but you know how to actually create something that can look good. And so this is a really nice starting point for a 3D artist who's serious about actually getting somewhere in this field. So I hope that's been enjoyable. I'm starting to get back into making these tutorials, so check out whatever the usual stuff is on YouTube, you know, subscribe and like and all that kind of jazz. These are all free, so feel free to comment. If you have questions, I'll try to get to those every now and then. But hopefully you've learned something, and enjoy. Happy modeling. Happy 3Ding. Cheers, guys.